beautiful humans. Welcome to another episode of Spectra Services. Today, we're getting right back in the swing of things with an interview with a wonderful human being that I've met here in Victoria. Margot Wilson, and she does amazing work with a publishing agency around trans folks and supporting trans people. So before we get into defining what that actually is, let's get going and talk about who Margot Wilson is. Do you want to describe who you are?
Yeah, it's hard to think about who I am outside of what I've done.
Yes.
I'm an anthropologist by training, as
Yes.
you know. Worked at the University of Victoria in the Department of Anthropology for many years.
Yes.
Worked as an administrator in the Social Science Dean's Office.
Yes.
Also in Faculty of Graduate Studies with Aaron Javor, who some of your audience members may know.
Yes.
And retired recently.
Mm-hmm.
So the publishing is a kind of retirement project.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know how much you want to know about who I am. I grew up in Toronto.
Okay.
Moved here 28 years ago.
Yes.
To take a job at the university.
Mm-hmm.
Have a number of children, some of whom you saw today.
Yes.
And a little dog.
Yes.
And that's probably me in a nutshell.
Okay. So before we get into the trans publishing, there's a bit of a story that comes with that in terms of how you got roped into that, if I can use that phrase.
Fair enough.
So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. In 2014, Aaron Javor, who is the chair in transgender studies at the University of Victoria, actually before he was the chair, organized a conference, a symposium.
Yes.
I think there were about less than 100 people, maybe 85, 87 people there. And on the last morning, there was a panel called the Elders Panel.
Okay.
And these were a series of people who have been in the trans community for a long time. So Stephanie Castle, who's a Canadian woman, who founded the Zenith Foundation.
Yeah.
And Ariadne Kane, who is a longtime crossdresser and was one of the founding members of Fantasia Fair.
Okay.
And of course, Aaron was there on the panel. And it was moderated by Jude Patton.
Okay.
Another person on the panel was Ricky Swin, who founded the Swin Foundation some years ago in the United States. It has closed now, but their holdings have been transferred to the University of Victoria Transgender Archives. And after the session, I, as an anthropologist, was sitting there thinking, wonderful stories. So these people are telling about how they discovered that they were trans, what their transition looked like. And I sat in the audience as an anthropologist and went, someone needs to be capturing these stories before. By definition, these elders are going to leave us. Yeah. And so how are we going to preserve that information, which will go with them when they pass away? And after the session, I went to Aaron and I said, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And someone should be doing something about it. And I have the training and I have the interest, but I am on the periphery of the community. I'm not trans myself. I don't have any trans people in my family, in my biological family. I have them in my social family. Yeah. And what to do? Yeah. And Aaron said, talk to them. Yeah. I mean, just this brilliant insight. So I kind of crept up to each of them individually and gave them my card and said, would you consider writing your life history with me, collaborating with me on it? And I expected that, maybe one person would say yes. And I asked Jude Patton, Ariadne Kane, and Stephanie Castle. Okay. And all three of them said yes immediately on the spot. And then it was like, oh my God, what have I done? Yeah. Because this is a huge job. My methodology is a very intensive one. I don't sit down for an hour with somebody and do an interview.
Yeah.
I interview them for hours, week after week after week, and we develop a relationship based on trust and respect and all those other things that are important.
Yes.
And more than that, what I've discovered is that if we tell our stories more than once, we elaborate, we tell them slightly differently, we use slightly different words, the nuance changes. And so what I've done is taken these many, many hours of recorded conversations, had them transcribed, and then sorted, and then superimposed on each other. So you get these lovely variations of the same story. And then my job is to try and find my way through to make a full representation of that person's experience, and also to try and preserve their voice, their attitude, their perspective. And so with the 3 yeses right off the top, I had to go to ethics approval at the university, of course, which took a little time, but now I have literally hundreds of hours of recorded conversations with these individuals. Nice. And since then, I have also begun working with Joanna Clark, and there are several other trans people that I'm approaching that are thinking about it. So, I mean, this is going to be the end of my life work. I'm going to be doing this forever because I love every minute of it. And
good.
You know what? These are not research relationships anymore. These are personal relationships where, I visit with people and I'm very concerned when they're ill. And if I don't hear from them for a couple of weeks, I start worrying about whether they're okay. So that was a very exciting sort of beginning. Now, of course, the Moving Trans History Forward conference has been held every 2 years since then. We just had one in March of 2018. Yes. I did not attend the one in 2016. Okay.
So if you can, because right now what you're talking about is the present book project that you're doing, correct? What could, for those that maybe are allies who are maybe not as familiar with the trans experience, all of those kind of things, what would you name as why it's important that these stories get out? Why is it in this way that you're doing it?
Really good question. I think there's the historical piece, which I've sort of touched on briefly. But more than that, the experience that the elders in the community have had are very different from the experiences that people have today. So these are folks who came up before the internet, before connectivity, at a time when to be trans or to be gay or lesbian or different in any way, I mean, the word transgender didn't even exist at that time. And all many of these people felt about themselves was that they were different. And they didn't always necessarily understand how they were different, but they understood that their difference was less acceptable in society than perhaps it is today, or perhaps one would wish that it would be. So I think that it's important for people in the trans community now to understand that they are literally standing on the shoulders of giants. And you've heard me say that before.
Absolutely.
We need to know our history, and we need to know who were our pioneers, who went first, and who blazed the trail of people. Absolutely. I also think for people who are allies or parents or counselors or teachers of trans students, you can read a very personal account of one person's transition and life experience and extrapolate that. And hopefully what these histories do is allow people to understand that there's no reason to be afraid. I was showing you earlier that I had just read the introduction to Jameson Green's book called Becoming a Man. And Aaron DeVore writes that many of the reasons that people have negative attitudes towards people in the gender fluid community is that they're afraid. And they're afraid of difference. And they're also, I think, afraid of making mistakes. I don't want to insult you by using the wrong pronouns. I don't want to insult you by not being able to control my face because I react in a certain way to you. and where people who lived inside the binary, who are, straight, white, heterosexual males and females, if someone reacts to me, I see something on their face, I never think that it's about my gender. I never think that it's about, my presentation in the world. And I think that there's an extra layer of complication for people who are outside of the binary, if you will. And it's important for those of us who have lived inside it all our lives, who may or may not understand the experience of other people. We have to open our minds. And so what I'm hoping is that that's what these histories are going to do. That not only are they preserving these stories that will be lost, but more than that, they're kind of cautionary tales for those of us who would like to understand what's going on inside the community, who would like not to put our foot in the yogurt, who would like not to insult somebody or upset somebody. And, my own experience is that the community is extremely welcoming. And I'm constantly aware of my position on the periphery. I'm flattered to be called an ally by people inside the community. That's not a label that one can place on oneself. I can't say I'm an ally until someone tells me I am. And so I wear that very proudly. And all of that kind of led to discovering that although there's one I know of, perhaps two presses in the States who specifically publish on transgender issues. There is no press in Canada that does that specifically. And although my work is not specifically with Canadians and not specifically with the elderly, but that's where I've started with it. And that's sort of the impetus. Now, Stephanie Castle, whose book just came out in March, called Girl in the Dream, was a Canadian, did have her own publishing companies in the two parts of her personality. So on the male part of her personality, she was publishing about shipping and the marine life. And in her trans life, she published two nonfiction books. And then she published a series of novels with trans characters. And Stephanie and I, at one point, Stephanie was expressing concern that her children were not as interested in her publishing life, and that she was coming to the end of her time and her energy. And I kind of approached her and said, well, what do you say? Maybe we could work together. So we decided to open Castle Carrington Publishing. So Castle is Stephanie's mother's maiden name. Carrington is my mother's maiden name. And that's how we came to that. It sounds good. Castle Carrington sounds kind of fixed. So we envisioned that as a kind of umbrella publishing company. And then underneath that, I opened Transgender Publishing. And Stephanie already had Stephanie Castle Publications. So when Stephanie passed away, her son, who was the executor of the will, agreed to turn over Stephanie Castle Publications to me. So now those all exist out there in the world. Stephanie's book was published by Transgender Publishing. And we're working on a series of other books. There's an edited volume that I'm very excited about called Glimmerings. It comes out of something Stephanie said to me in an interview. She said, as a young child, many trans people recognize by the age of 3 or 4 that they are different in some way. And whether they can articulate that difference or whether they have the language for it depends. But Stephanie said, when those things come to you in a glimmer, quote unquote, you don't always understand them. You kind of unpack them later in your life and you begin to understand your experience. And that has always stuck in my head. And I thought, glimmering is a really good kind of metaphor, if you will, for what happens to someone when they suddenly become aware of their authentic self, which may not be the self that was assigned at birth, or the self that is imposed on by the public or by the family or by siblings or by friends and so on. And so the more I thought about it and talked to people in the community, I got a lot of positive feedback. So some of the really well-known people in the community are writing for this volume. And I have the privilege of editing it. I've twisted Erin's arm, and so Erin DeBoer is coming on as a co-editor, because I think this is really important that we get it right. And I'm envisioning that this is something that someone early in their transition might be interested in, or somebody who knows these people and wants to read more about, the deep, fine detail of their experience. So, if you know Miss Bob, or if you know Dallas Denny, or if you know Jameson Green, or if you know Rupert Raj, those people are going to be writing for this volume. And that I'm anticipating will come out early next year. I am working on another volume with a young trans man who has written his life history as a kind of creative nonfiction based on flashbacks. So from his position now as a fully transitioned individual back to his life and how difficult it was. And he talks about being a historian, but having misrepresented his own past because he had difficulty coming to terms with it. And so that was originally written in Dutch, and we're translating it into English.
Very cool.
And I'm hoping that that will be out perhaps before the end of the year or early next year. Right now, the title is a direct translation from the Dutch, is My Untrue Past. I'm kind of thinking about whether we need to change the title and make it a little, because My Untrue Past doesn't really explain, So we're working on that. And then, and my friend Gail Roberts, who lives in Vancouver and is one of the first people to transition in the BC educational system. She was indeed a high school teacher and administrator when she transitioned. And she has also written something she calls creative nonfiction. Juxtaposed, so chapters juxtaposed with more sort of factual essays. So you can read the personal story, and then you can read the context of that personal story in an essay following. So that that volume is called From Shame to Freedom, and I'm expecting it'll be out early next year as well. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So if I'm hearing you right, so is there any limitation to if a trans person wanted to write a story or anything? Is there a limitation to genre or what that looks like? Or
at this point, the way we're set up, I'm anticipating that all of the sort of nonfiction type writing would come under transgender publishing. That's my intent. And then anything that would be more fictional, like novels or poetry, would come under Stephanie Castle Publications. And they're all linked. The websites are all there. And if someone was writing something that was not on a trans issue, but was perhaps a trans author, then I would be open to publishing it either under transgender publishing or under Castle Pyramid. Because I think that there needs to be that opening there.
Absolutely.
For not only writing about trans issues, but also a place for trans authors to go.
Absolutely.
I mean, it has to be good quality stuff. And this is one of the interesting things that I'm doing with both Gail and Alex, who are the two volumes I'm working on, is that, we're having to negotiate. What is good reading? The reputation of any company is based on its product. So it has to be good. It has to be good writing. It has to be interesting and engaging. It has to, draw the reader in. I think in the case of both of these volumes, they are going to be very interesting. And it's just a case of getting the word out there that we're starting to do this. I mean, this is a very small individual sort of startup. And but I think that this is a timely topic. And I think that parents and counselors and teachers and community members are wanting to know more, to understand more. And it takes a lot of courage to walk up to somebody in the community. Because you don't know how they'll respond. I first, at some level, I got involved because one of my students came and declared himself to me.
Yeah.
He was a trans man. And we started talking, and he was telling me about a conference that goes on in the United States.
Yeah.
And I said, is curiosity enough?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious and I'm interested, and I would love to go to this conference, but is curiosity enough? And he said, absolutely. And so I hired him to be my research assistant for the weekend, because I was afraid that I would make a mistake, that I would insult somebody or embarrass myself or embarrass somebody else. And as I said, the community has been very, very welcoming to me, and which is a message I would love to get out to people who stand outside the community and are curious. But this is another way to reach people who have no direct access to the community.
Yeah, because one of the things that I have, you know, being on the other end as a trans person, sometimes people are a lot of times afraid to ask, what is my pronouns? How do people refer to me? Where do I sit on this spectrum of things, right? And how do people relate to me? And it's really no different than me, you know, relating to a person of color or a person with a disability, right? And the first thing is creating that conversation. Now, I do recommend to folks, and I've said this before, do not have your first question, are you having the sex change, or what genitals do you have? No.
It's incredible that those are questions that you would never ask a binary individual.
Yes, absolutely.
You would never ask that question. And how people can feel that it's okay to ask those questions, I don't know.
I think part of it is because we are programmed in this presentation equals how we dress, what the genitals are, all of those things. That's what their programming is. However, what we're learning is that that's not always the case. And so what ends up happening for a lot of people when they learn that doesn't equal the other, does not compute kind of thing. And so that's the first thing that comes up is in their mind is that, what does your genitals look like? Even though it's not appropriate, that's the first thing that comes to a person's mind because they want that resolved, you know? And because it's also, in general, sex is a taboo subject still, right? And so I'm not saying that, especially initially, it's not a go conversation, but there's a flip side of that too, of having the conversation in general about sexuality, the complexity of sexuality, sex, gender, all of those things. And once that starts to happen, the need to find out what an individual has between their legs, I believe, starts to dissipate. Because now it's like, okay, I've kind of got it now. Right? And so, but until that starts to happen, and this is obviously another, you know, YouTube video I want to do with the conversation around the importance of Soji and all of these kind of things and how that can contribute to what we're talking about. You know, until those things start to happen and it's normalized, that conversation about what's between our legs, unfortunately, even though it's not appropriate, it will probably still continue for a while.
Yes. And I think that that's a cautionary note for people who are transitioning. Is that that kind of question is going to come up, and you need to be prepared for it.
Absolutely.
It makes me think about when I was working on my doctorate. One of my professors said, you need to have a one-sentence response. When people say, oh, what's your research on? And you need to be able to deliver that one sentence without any emotional baggage attached to it. Because most people are then going to say, oh, that's really interesting. Did you see the game on Saturday night? Because they don't really want to hear about it. They just feel like they need to ask the question, or they just blurt it out or something. So, you know, I think that advice holds in a lot of situations. Where if you can create a response to someone who asks that inappropriate question, a kind of neutral response that doesn't
Absolutely.
cost you any emotional currency,
Yes.
then you can just say, actually, that's not a question I feel comfortable answering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or, I mean, if you want to be a little more aggressive, you could say, actually, that's quite a rude question and I'm not going to answer it.
Yeah.
Or, sometimes people will say, can I ask you a question? And then you're kind of set up. I always say, sure, as long as you understand that I may not answer it.
Yeah.
Because, I don't have any secrets, but on the other hand, there are some things that it's none of anybody's business.
Yeah.
Which reminds me of one of the articles that's coming up in the Glimmerings column, written by a two-spirit person from Washington State. And this person, I'm not going to use any pronouns if I can do it properly. It's very difficult for some of us.
Yes.
Says that for the first time ever, they were asked, what pronouns do you prefer? And this person said, I've never been asked that question before.
Yeah.
And then goes on at some length in this essay explaining that being two-spirited means that you're Aboriginal.
Yeah.
That's an appropriate use of two-spirit. That being Aboriginal, one is often defined by someone else, the government or, your tribal band or whatever.
Yeah.
And so to suddenly be asked, how do you define yourself is very difficult.
Yeah.
And in the end, this person summarizes by saying, unless you're going to have sex with me, what difference does it make to you? Yeah. Which is a brilliant answer. So I guess if you really, really wanted to be provocative when someone asks you, that's the answer.
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely.
Are you interested in me sexually? Otherwise, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope that someone, not asking about genitals, but asking about third person pronouns would just be trying to be appropriate and correct and polite and sensitive.
Yeah,
and that's easy to forget. And so there's a two-way street there that
absolutely
those of us in the binary have to be prepared to be open and accepting and really trying hard. And people who are outside of the binary need to be a little bit patient with us.
Yeah.
Because it's very frightening.
It is.
And it's embarrassing when you do something really wrong.
Yeah. And I think we need to understand, because occasionally trans or non-binary folks will take offense. And it's not about the individual that's asking the question necessarily. Because a lot of times what's happened, there's this whole history of trauma that comes with being trans, where we have been, on the bus and getting negative reactions, threat of attack, maybe have been attacked, maybe from our family or outside of that, or whatever the case is. So there's and there's also associated PTSD that comes with that.
Absolutely.
So if occasionally someone does react negatively to maybe a question about pronoun or whatever, it's not about you. Remember, it is about that person's history and trauma they're coming from. And the best way to navigate that is just with compassion.
Absolutely.
Just apologize.
Absolutely.
That I didn't mean to offend, and then try and move on from there. Most people are pretty, as you said, are pretty good, but we're a family. Trans and non-binary community are a community that's in the process of healing and growing and all of that, but it comes with that baggage of trauma and all of those things. And so it's this two-way, as you said, on both ends, trying to navigate and support each other and be honest and all of those kind of things. And it's not always easy, but if we can try to do that, then we can move forward together.
Well, it reminds me of my daughter who was received a card from somebody who she felt was in transition.
Yes.
And had originally met this person with their male name and now got a birthday card from this person signed with their female name, which was a version of their male name, which is often the case. And she called me and said, I don't know what to do. So I said, I think you should approach this person and say, I noticed that you signed the card
Mhm.
using
Yeah.
this name. Is that how you would prefer to be addressed from now on?
Yeah.
And that person can say yes, and then they can talk to you like you've opened the door.
Absolutely.
And you've said, I'm sensitive to what's going on with you. I'm paying attention. And that's exactly what happened. And they developed a lovely friendship afterwards. And so it was a very positive experience for both of them, I think. But I guess perhaps that's what I'm hoping will come out of some of these volumes that will be published in the next year, is that there's that sort of sensitivity that is sort of revealed subtly through the stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the commentary on the stories.
And I think one of the brilliant things of when you have a collection of stories, because there's often this mythos around that all of our stories are the same.
Yes.
That, all of us have grown up 2, 3 years old knowing our gender, and it's quite binary, female to male or male to female, but that's not always the case. It's a complex diversity of experiences and things, and some people have either suppressed who they are or just realize it. Either it just transformed or it came to the consciousness of the individual at the age 60 or 30, right? Everyone's so different, right? And when you have it all together, you kind of see the complexity and diversity in that, and the complexity of glimmerings or realizations of how that comes to be, how people realize. Because I know one of the myths out there is that, somebody, converts you to being trans and all of these things, but this is not how it happens. No one, and I know in my experience, and I know in many people's experience, there was no word for trans.
Correct.
There was no conversation what trans was.
That's right.
But there was this internal knowing something was not fitting.
Yeah.
Until, boom, you find either someone else's trans or pieces will.
Or there's something in the newspaper or on the television.
Exactly.
Or, many of the elderly trans people in the community never saw another trans person until they themselves took the responsibility for reaching out and going to trans people who went to gay and lesbian clubs because at least they were accepted there.
Exactly.
And then maybe they met someone who said something, or they saw the Christine Jorgensen story, or and these days there are other people who are transitioning. There's Chaz Bono, and there's Caitlyn Jenner, and so there are some people who are, but certainly people who felt as though they were trans before the mid 1950s didn't have any role models, quote unquote, per se. I think there's also another thing. There's this huge pressure and expectation that society puts on individuals to conform.
Absolutely.
And so many individuals, it's not that they suddenly wake up when they're 60 and go, oh gosh, I'm in the wrong body. But that in fact they have known that all along, but they've been suppressing it for whatever reason.
And how many of those people, and we'll never know the numbers, actually have committed suicide or put themselves in risky behavior, whether it's drugs or otherwise, because they can't handle not being who they are, but they're in a society that they feel doesn't allow them to be authentic. And we'll never know the numbers of them, but I can only imagine they're really high.
I think so.
And so the ones who have pushed themselves through are incredibly strong, maybe lucky, somehow they found the will to continue and then found the way at the end when they retire or whatever to step into that authenticity in the best way they could.
Well, I know that in the Vancouver Gender Clinic, which is now part of, I think it's one of the health organizations over on the mainland now. But at the time they had the gender clinic, there was an expectation that you would deal with all your other problems first. So if you were, a smoker or you were using drugs or whatever, that you were to deal with that first. But what they discovered is that many people, at the point they realized that they actually, the transition was a possibility for them.
Yes.
Those problems, if you will, fell away.
Yes.
That they were just self-medicating with drugs or sex or alcohol or
whatever it is.
Or cigarettes, whatever it was. Exactly. And that at the point someone listened to them and recognized them and said, yes, this is a possibility for you.
Yeah.
Then suddenly all of those crutches weren't needed anymore. Yeah. It's fascinating.
It is.
And conundrum.
And unfortunately, as a counselor, and I've worked with maybe hundreds of different trans people from across the different spectrums and that side of it. Unfortunately, even though I've seen that, to the extent of individuals with having deep mental illness.
Yes.
But because it's so severe, doctors have not allowed them to transition, even though, not to say it's true in every case, but a lot of the cases, if they start transitioning, their mental illnesses would either eliminate totally or reduce.
Yes.
And it's like, to me, it's a no-brainer. You know, it doesn't mean we're going to solve all the issues, but we're going to solve a lot of them by allowing the person to step into their authenticity, whatever that looks like.
Exactly.
Right? And so, to me, it's still frustrating being in a helping person with all these other trans people, and the medical system may have shifted, like you've said, but hasn't shifted all the way it needs to yet. Exactly and so there's still some problems in a lot of trans people who are not getting the support that they need to go where they need to go, or
and in fact,
get relief, right?
You know, my feeling, my personal feeling about it is that it's actually astonishing that there are as many balanced, healthy trans people as there are.
Yes.
Because no one would choose this for themselves. No. This is a something that comes from within. Yeah. It's not, you don't get converted. You don't get, convinced that, hey, this would be a good idea, because no one would choose such a difficult life for themselves, not by choice. Yeah. And I think that being gay or lesbian is the same.
Absolutely.
That's not, it's a personal mandate. It comes from deep inside you, not from some outside influence. And it's like handedness. You're not going to stop someone from being left-handed by hitting them with a ruler, which is the way we used to do things.
Absolutely.
And you're not going to convince someone to not be trans by telling them that they shouldn't be, or that it's against, society or God or whatever.
What's ended up happening is, when those things happening, is we convince the person to shut that part of themselves off, pretend that they're not that anymore.
Yes,
exactly. And we know that, for example, gay conversion therapy, those kind of things, doesn't work.
Yes.
It actually creates more harm. Yes. And in a lot of cases, the people who've so-called converted, they become manipulators of the people within the group to manipulate them for sex and other things, because they're not getting the need met because they suppressed it.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is the interesting thing about whenever we suppress something, the side effect is a lot of negative behaviors, attitudes, etc., etc., etc. Whereas we support people in authenticity, we get quite the opposite. And it's interesting how that happens.
Well, that's the subtitle of the Glimmerings volume. Yes. Recognition, authenticity, and gender variance.
Very cool.
Because I think those are sort of key themes that emerge out of the material. And as you say, there are some common themes, but there are huge individual variations within the stories. Not just in this volume, but within the community at large. And I think those are, again, cautionary tales that we can, it might not be our exact detailed story, but we can learn from that person's story. We can create empathy and understanding and kindness out of all of those things.
So being mindful of the time, I
Yes.
want to wrap up soon, but a couple more questions.
Okay.
So let's say there is, trans person out there that is wanting to plunge into the writing world. What kind of suggestions would you give that to that person?
Oh, that's a tough one. I guess depending on your background, definitely write from the heart. Write in your own voice. Don't try and write what you think you should write, but write what is true, what is your truth, what is your authenticity. If you have not had a lot of experience writing, you might want to consult with somebody who does professional editing. You might want to take a writing workshop. I know people who have been writing for years who still go to writing workshops. In fact, Erin DeVore and I were talking about this the other day, that, as academics, our perspective on writing is very academic and very theoretical, very sort of factual. And we were talking about how it is to come to terms with something that is more less factual, if you will, the creative piece of writing. And you need to find your voice, and then you need to find what's the genre of that voice. And for example, Stephanie's novels have trans characters and address a lot of the social issues that surround being trans. But she's British, and she writes in a very sort of, I think, stuffy. I should be saying this because these books are on my website. The stories are really interesting, but they're very, very British in many ways. Now, I read a lot of biography, and it depends. If you're American, or you're British, or you're Australian, or you're Japanese, you're going to write from your cultural perspective. And so it's important to, like for me as an editor, it's important for me to recognize that those voices are all equally legitimate. And so I think for a writer, it's important to A, find your voice, and B, honor it. And be consistent with it. But then get some help if you need it. And these are some of the services that we're beginning to offer through the publishing company, is sort of editorial support. And I have a series of people, bless their hearts, who read for me. So when I have a volume that's just about ready to go, I can send it out to them, and they'll read it and send it back to me and say, actually, maybe you need to shorten this or lengthen that, or I don't understand the language. Because, the more time you spend in the community, the more you learn the language. And we speak a language that people outside the community don't necessarily speak. So there are all those kinds of things. But I would say write, and write some more, and be prepared for lots of rewriting, lots of critique. And for someone who's writing for the first time, it's important to recognize that there's a great deal of time and energy goes into editing someone else's work. And assuming it's done with a good intent, you can learn a great deal from someone else commenting on your work, because you can get to the point where you can't see the forest for the trees. You're so engaged in the detail that you miss the bigger story, and you want people to read what you've written. Get attached to. There are lots of online websites that talk about how to write. And I belong to a number of them that are also publishing websites, but they send all kinds of good information out about, how to use metaphors, and, how to find your authentic voice, and all those sorts of things. So read about writing, and then write, and be prepared for making changes.
I do know, like when I was doing my master's thesis, and I have a learning disability, grammar, spelling, all of that. But the thing is, the biggest thing that helped me is just getting help, getting people to look at it over and over and over again until it's clear, and getting it from different perspectives, right? Like there's a book I'm going to be writing on my queer genograms, and I'll be done a workshop on that, so I won't get into all of that detail. But basically, making sure I have different perspectives who are reading that, professionals, people in the community, families, all of those kind of things, to give different perspectives, not just the grammar and the spelling, which is obviously important for me, but just getting those different perspectives to make sure that all of those people, when other people from that community read it, it makes sense to them.
Yes.
Because if I speak just to social workers, but if someone else speaks, they go, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. Different groups and whatever have different languages too. So.
Well, that's one of the interesting things I'm doing with this volume that's being translated from Dutch. So the whole thing has been translated.
Yes.
But the idiom doesn't always translate.
Yes.
And so every once in a while I come across something that's just in English, it doesn't work.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense. And so we're having to negotiate each of those individual nuances to make sure that we get it right, because a Dutch audience reading it recognizes the metaphor.
Yes.
Where an English audience reading it might not.
Exactly.
And so I think there's lots to be said about that. And I think, I really believe you have to be reading at the same time as you're writing.
Yes.
And get lots of people to give you feedback on it, and understand that feedback. I mean, don't ask people who don't like you to read your stuff.
Of course, they're not going to be a balance.
Ask people who are going to give you really creative feedback and say, this isn't clear to me, or could you say it a different way, or what is your intent here?
Yeah, absolutely.
And to be open to that sort of critique.
Yeah, totally. That's going to be interesting, because I'm writing one of the pieces for the Glimmerings. And so that's a different writing style than I'm used to. So that's going to be an interesting learning experience for me. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. And what I've been doing with my authors is, I read through it, and mostly I don't impose my voice on the authors.
Yes.
I try to let them speak for themselves. But when there's something that just doesn't fit, doesn't feel right somehow, then I bounce it back and say, well, what about this, or what about that, or can you clarify this? And I enjoy doing that. It's the wordsmithing is the part that I really enjoy. And I'm busy entertaining myself doing that instead of doing my own writing right now. But that's okay. That's okay. And I'll get back in the saddle and start writing again in another month or so. But for now, it's been really fun to work with all of the authors. And you too?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that's a good place for us to stop right now. Thank you to all of the viewers. We will be posting all of Margot's information on the YouTube description, and all the links to her publishing agency and all of that kind of stuff that you would need. So if anybody's interested, please check that out.
Yes.
If you have any questions about Spectra services, I will have links below as well. If you really like this, please press subscribe. Even click off the bell to make sure you keep up to date on all my amazing videos. I'll be doing lots more coming up soon on life skills, spirituality. Live conversations are coming up, but I'll let you know once that gets more settled. And if you have any questions for me or Margot, please post them below, and we'll make sure we get back to you. All right, thank you.